Good morning. Good morning, or afternoon, as the case may be, evening. So last week, we started talking about a text from the 8th century composed by Shantideva, a mendicant monk and scholar in northern India. A text that is entitled in translation, A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life. And we talked about chapter 1, which has to do with bodhicitta. And then we'll be talking about chapter 2 today. So what is a bodhisattva? A bodhisattva, translated usually as a awakening being, someone who is awakening. And further, someone who is striving for awakening, not solely for one's own benefit, but for the general benefit, for the benefit of all beings. You can make an analogy of, if you've been on an airplane flight and the steward or stewardess will counsel you that in the event that the oxygen masks drop down, you should put your own mask on first and then assist any children or others who need assistance with their mask. The idea being that if you don't put your own mask on first, you may succumb to hypoxia before you're able to assist others. And by putting your own mask in first, you set an example for others and also allow yourself the opportunity to assist others in their efforts to become awakened. So that is what a bodhisattva is. And there are some virtues associated with being a bodhisattva. Traditionally, generosity, morality, patience, vigor, meditation, and wisdom. So what is bodhicitta? Bodhicitta is the aspiration to be a bodhisattva, the aspiration to eventually become a Buddha, not for just one's own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. To engage actively in this life for the benefit of all beings. So Shantideva composed this, drawing on a number of sources and his own remarkable creativity as a guide to the Bodhisattva way of life. And chapter 2 is entitled, depending on the translation you're reading, Confession of Sin, which may surprise some of you, or it's sometimes translated as Confession of Faults or Disclosure of Wrongdoing. The Sanskrit word that sin or faults or wrongdoing is translated from is papa, which has the flavor of unskillful intentional action, unwholesome intentional action. So it's talking about how to deal with the situation where those things arise with yourself. And confession can be interpreted as contrition or repentance. Really has to do in some measure with just honesty, being honest about your shortcomings and the harm that they may have caused others or yourself or both. So I think there are a number of topics that Shantideva addresses in the course of this text. Confession or repentance being one of them, but they all have to do with attenuating the ego. In a sense, managing the problem of self-centeredness. So I'll read some sections from the text to give you a flavor of Shantideva's style. He writes in, it's actually in the form of a long poem with many verses. In order to adopt that jewel of the mind, he's referring to bodhicitta, I make offerings to the Tathagatas, to the Buddhas, to the stainless jewel of the sublime Dharma, to the teachings of the Buddhas, and to the children of the Buddhas, those who aspire to be bodhisattvas, who are oceans of excellent qualities. As many flowers, fruits, and medicinal herbs as there are, and as many jewels as there are in the world, and clear and pleasant waters, jeweled mountains, forested regions, and other delightful and solitary places, vines shining with the ornaments of lovely flowers, and trees with branches bowed with delicious fruit. Fragrances and incenses, wish-fulfilling trees, jeweled trees, lakes adorned with lotuses, enchanted calls of wild geese in the worlds of gods and other celestials, uncultivated crops, planted crops, and other things that adornment the venerable ones. All these that are unowned and that extend throughout space. I bring to mind and offer to the foremost of sages, together with their children, may those worthy of precious gifts, the greatly merciful ones, the compassionate toward me, accept these from me. May those worthy of precious gifts, the greatly merciful ones, compassionate toward me, accept these from me. So, in addition to talking about confession and repentance in this chapter, a couple other themes come up. That first one being offerings, generosity. So cultivation of generosity, making offerings, is one way of cultivating attenuation of self-centeredness, giving things away. And here, Shantideva is talking about not just his own material possessions, he's talking about the spirit of offering all of these beautiful things to those who have preceded us, who have helped us along the way. who may or may not be Buddhists, by the way. All of those individuals who have embodied wisdom and compassion and who have enunciated these teachings that are of an aid to us. All the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. A bit farther along, I go for refuge in the Buddha as far as the quintessence of enlightenment. I go for refuge in the Dharma and the community of Bodhisattvas. And many of you will recognize this as the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the typical three jewels of Buddhist refuge. So refuge is another topic that comes up in this chapter. Offerings, refuge, and contrition or repentance. And in this next section, he gets into discussing repentance. Whatever sin I, a brute, have committed or caused others to commit in this life and others throughout the beginningless cycle of existence, and anything in which I have deludedly rejoiced, thereby harming myself, that transgression I confess, overcome by remorse. Whatever offense I have committed, out of disrespect with my body, speech, and mind against the three jewels, Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, against mothers and fathers, and against spiritual mentors and others. And whatever terrible vices I, a sinner, defiled with many faults, have done, O guides, I confess them all. How shall I escape it? Rescue me quickly. May death not soon creep upon me before my vices have vanished. Death does not differentiate between tasks done and undone. This traitor, death, is not to be trusted by the healthy or the ill, for it is like an unexpected great thunderbolt. So I'm reading here from the translation by Vesna and Alan Wallace, a translation from the original Sanskrit. And I mentioned that the Sanskrit word for sin, that they translated as sin, is papa. And they did so advisedly. And they actually, there's a little footnote talking about how, well, some people in Western cultures may have a lot of associations with this word that are undesirable. And that may be true. And that's why I think other translators have used faults or shortcomings or wrongdoings. But the Wallaces thought that sin was the most appropriate translation. They comment, however, that it is closely aligned with the concept of unwholesome or unskillful intentional action. Now, when you hear this passage, and likewise when you read in other religious traditions, when authors are talking about confession and they're referring to their own wrongdoings, it sounds like they're all serial killers. It sounds like they've just done these awful, terrible things. But I think it has to do with sensitivity to things that are unwholesome or unskillful. these authors have cultivated that sensitivity so that they can view their faults, their wrongdoings, their shortcomings as their harm that they do to others as a problem that can be addressed. And that's one major point about repentance, confession in the Buddhist tradition. There are, going back to the times of the Buddha, confessional ceremonies that typically occurred at around the time of the full moon, once a month or sometimes twice a month, in which the monastics associated with the Buddha would confess when they had violated the precepts or done something else that they considered unskillful or harmful. And the point of this is not to drown in guilt, because we all have shortcomings and faults and do unskillful and unwholesome things, but to try to address it as an issue, as a problem to be solved. And one way of summarizing the way to address such things is the formula: face it, accept it, respond to it, and let it go. Facing it, being sensitive to one's shortcomings and faults. The opposite of this would be a formula that's been in the newspapers recently: denial, defense, and deflection. But here, Shantideva, and really all of the authors and wisdom traditions, are encouraging us to be sensitive to our shortcomings, to be aware of them, and then being aware of them, facing it. And the next step is accepting it, taking responsibility. I did this. The third, respond to it, which may involve some sort of reparation if possible. Some things aren't amenable to reparation, but other things are. Some sort of reparation. Or just confession or apology, if that's appropriate. And then, having done those things and resolving not to repeat the same mistake again and again, even though we all do, to let it go. And it can be an iterative process, because we all have a tendency to repeat the same mistakes again and again. But if possible, to repeat them less often, or perhaps over time, learn from our mistakes and avoid them entirely. A little farther on, Shantideva says this: right now, I go for refuge to the protectors of the world, whose power is great, to the jinas, and these are followers of the Buddha, who strive to protect the world and who eliminate every fear. These are the Bodhisattvas, the jinas. Likewise, I earnestly go for refuge to the Dharma, that is mastered by them and that annihilates the fear of the cycle of existence, and to the assembly of bodhisattvas as well. Trembling with fear, I offer myself to Samantabhadra, and my own will I offer myself to Manjushrigosa. Terrified, I utter a mournful cry to the protector Avalokiteshvara, whose conduct overshadows with compassion, that he may protect a sinner such as me. So this may be a little difficult for some Westerners as well, talking about going to these mythical figures. Samantabhadra, who is the Bodhisattva of practice, of generosity, and to Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and to Avalokiteshvara, he or she, he's sort of can be either one, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And I think at the time that this text was written, people perhaps weren't so literal. They had perhaps a more cultivated understanding of what this means, to talk about these mythical figures coming to help us. But I think we can relate to this in that you may have had the experience, I certainly have, of at times having a first reaction when someone does something of either offense or anger, irritation. And then you take a step back and start considering from a wider view the causes and conditions. The causes and conditions of whatever behavior you thought was offensive or provoking, and the causes and conditions of your reaction. And taking a wider view, it is as if compassion sort of walks into the room, as if there is a presence there that wasn't there before. And that sense of presence, I think, is the embodiment of Avalokiteshvara. Not that we have to, believe in Santa Claus, but we can believe in the availability of these presences that can help us when we're struggling with difficulties. So Samantabhadra, Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara are there to help us. And finally, at the end of the chapter, Shantideva says, in this case, only this concern is appropriate for me day and night. How shall I surely escape suffering on account of that non-virtue? Whatever vice, whatever natural misdeed, and whatever misdeed by prohibition, I, an ignorant fool, have accumulated. Terrified of suffering, all this I confess, standing with folded hands in the presence of the protectors and bowing repeatedly. May the guides be aware of my transgressions together with my iniquity. O protectors, may I not commit this evil again. So again, I don't think that Shantideva was likely to be much more evil than any of us, but he did have a fine sensitivity to his shortcomings and is advocating being honest about them. facing them, accepting them, responding to them, and ultimately being free of them. Another purpose of confession and of offering and of taking refuge is the cultivation rather of humility. And humility is attenuation of the ego, dropping away of self-centeredness, opening ourselves up to the picture beyond ourselves, to the view beyond ourselves, to the view that takes in all beings. So those are some thoughts about chapter 2 of this guide for bodhisattvas. And I think I'll stop talking there. So how does some of this strike you? These practices of offering, of taking refuge, and of confession are a part of the liturgy of every wisdom tradition. The good thing about liturgy is that it is a recurrent reminder. I guess the downside of liturgy is that it can get to be automatic and the meaning can be diluted. But these practices can be practiced in our daily lives every day, offering, being generous, confessing, being honest, and taking refuge. So how do we incorporate these teachings into everyday life? Does any of this resonate with you? Bring to mind any episodes, or are there any thoughts you would care to share about this? So we'll go into breakout rooms and then come back together in a few minutes. Thank you for listening today.